The mountain man's shadow fell across the wooden platform at Medicine Bow Station just as the last wagon pulled away, leaving behind only the woman in the gray traveling dress and the Wyoming wind that tried to steal her bonnet. Ethan Ramsey had not planned to stop in town that September afternoon in 1878, but his pack horse had thrown a shoe 3 miles back, and the blacksmith here owed him a favor from 2 winters past. He stood 6 feet 4 inches of hard-earned muscle beneath sun-darkened skin, his dark brown hair touching his shoulders in waves that had not seen a barber's scissors in over a year. The buckskin shirt stretched across his broad chest was worn soft from use, and the rifle slung over his back had kept him alive through more close calls than he cared to remember in the mountains. He had come down from his claim in the Medicine Bow Range for supplies, nothing more. But when he saw her standing there on that platform with her trunk at her feet and her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had gone white, something in his chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the thin September air. She was 20 years old, though he could not know that yet, with honey-colored hair that caught the afternoon light despite her best efforts to keep it pinned beneath her bonnet. Her face was pale, not from lack of sun, but from the particular kind of fear that came when a person realized they had made a terrible mistake, and there was no going back. Emma Oakley had traveled by train from Philadelphia, then by stagecoach for 2 days over roads that had rattled her bones and covered her in dust, all to reach this windswept station where her intended husband was supposed to meet her. The advertisement had been very specific about the date and time. She had answered his letter with 3 of her own over the course of 4 months, each one carefully composed at her tiny desk in the boarding house where she had worked since her parents died of fever. He had seemed kind in his letters, a shopkeeper named Harold Finch who needed a wife and offered security in return for companionship. She had not expected passion or romance, only safety and a place to belong. But Harold Finch had not come. The station manager, a grizzled man named Thompson with tobacco-stained whiskers, had shaken his head when she asked if there had been any messages. No one had come asking for her. No one had left word. He had suggested she wait, then he had disappeared into his office, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. That had been over an hour ago. The other passengers from her stagecoach had all been claimed by family or friends, their happy reunions making her isolation all the more acute. She had $11.30 in her reticule, no return ticket, and nowhere to go. The fear had started as a small, cold thing in her stomach, but it was growing with each passing minute. Ethan approached slowly, the way he would approach a spooked deer. His boots made hollow sounds on the wooden platform, and she turned at the noise, her green eyes going wide. He pulled off his hat, the gesture automatic despite his years in the wilderness. "Madam," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He had not spoken to another person in nearly 3 weeks. "Looks like you might be needing some help." Emma's first instinct was wariness. She had been warned about Western men, about their rough ways and rougher intentions. But something in this man's steady brown eyes made her hesitate before offering a polite dismissal. He looked like he belonged to the mountains themselves, all raw strength and weather-beaten competence, but his expression held none of the predatory calculation she'd learned to recognize in some of the men who had frequented the boarding house. "I am waiting for someone," she said, and was mortified when her voice trembled slightly. She straightened her spine. "He has been delayed, but I'm certain he will arrive soon." Ethan glanced at the sun, now well past its peak, and heading toward the western mountains. He looked at her trunk, which bore the marks of long travel, then at her face, where she was fighting to keep her composure. He had 2 sisters back in Missouri, both married now with families of their own, but he remembered what they had looked like when they were scared and trying not to show it. "How long you been waiting?" he asked. "That is not your concern, sir." The words came out sharper than she intended, born of fear rather than genuine anger. "I thank you for your interest, but I assure you I am quite all right." He could have left then. Should have left. He had his own business to attend to, and a woman waiting for a man was none of his affair. But something in him would not move his feet in the direction of the blacksmith's shop. He had spent the last 5 years in the mountains, first trapping, then finding his claim and working it with his own 2 hands. He had built a cabin that could withstand the winter storms, had learned which paths the elk took in autumn and where the best fishing pools lay in summer. He had chosen solitude deliberately after the war ended, and he had seen too many ways that men could die. But watching this young woman stand alone on the platform as the shadows grew longer, he felt the pull of something he had thought he had left behind when he rode west. "Thompson!" he called out, and the station manager appeared in his doorway, looking relieved that someone else was dealing with the situation. "You know a Harold Finch in town?" Thompson's expression shifted, something like discomfort crossing his weathered face. "I do." "He expecting someone?" The station manager's eyes slid to Emma, then away. "You might want to ask down at the saloon," he said finally, and disappeared back into his office before Ethan could press him further. The cold thing in Emma's stomach grew larger. There was meaning in that exchange, and none of it was good. Ethan saw the change in her face, the way her carefully maintained composure cracked just slightly at the edges. "Madam, I think maybe you and I should have a conversation," he said gently. "Maybe somewhere you could sit down." "I do not need to sit down," Emma said, but her legs felt unsteady beneath her skirts. "If you know something about Mr. Finch, I would appreciate you telling me directly." Ethan respected that, the steel in her voice even when she was clearly afraid. "All right then. I will go find out what is happening. You stay here with your trunk. I will be back directly." He did not wait for her to agree or disagree, just settled his hat back on his head and strode off the platform toward the main street of Medicine Bow. The town was small, barely 36 buildings clustered along the railroad line and the road that led north into the mountains. He knew most of the permanent residents by sight, if not by name, and he knew that news in a town this size traveled faster than a prairie fire. The saloon was called the Elkhorn, and when Ethan pushed through the doors, the afternoon drinkers looked up with varying degrees of interest. He saw Harold Finch immediately, a thin man with a prominent Adam's apple and nervous hands, sitting at a corner table with a bottle that was already half empty. Ethan had never spoken to the man before, but he had seen him around on previous supply runs. "Harold Finch," Ethan said, and his voice carried enough weight that the other conversations in the room died away. "There is a lady at the station. She seems to think you were supposed to meet her." Harold's face went from pale to red and back to pale again. He looked down at his whiskey glass. "I cannot," he said miserably. "I thought I could, but I cannot." Ethan felt anger kindle in his chest, hot and immediate. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled out the chair across from Harold, sitting down with enough force to make the table shake. "Explain," he said, and it was not a request. The story came out in fits and starts, pathetic and infuriating in equal measure. Harold had written the advertisement in a moment of loneliness, after his mother had died, and left him alone with his dry goods shop. He had corresponded with Emma through the spring and summer, building up a fantasy of marriage that had felt safe when she was thousands of miles away. But as the date of her arrival approached, panic had set in. He had never been good with women, he said. He was 38 years old and set in his ways. What did he know about being a husband? The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that he would disappoint her, that she would be unhappy, that the whole thing was a terrible mistake. So when the day came, he had come to the saloon instead of the station, and with each drink, he had convinced himself that she would simply go back east when he did not appear. "She came all this way," Ethan said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She gave up whatever life she had back east because you made her promises." "I know," Harold whispered. "I know it was wrong. But I cannot do it. I cannot marry her. Please, you tell her. Tell her I will pay for her ticket back to Philadelphia. Tell her I am sorry." Ethan's hands clenched into fists on the table. He had killed men during the war, had fought hand to hand in places he still saw sometimes when he closed his eyes. He was not proud of it, but he knew how to hurt someone when necessary. Right now, looking at Harold Finch's weak, self-pitying face, he wanted very badly to drag the man outside and teach him what it meant to break a promise to someone vulnerable. But violence would not help the woman waiting at the station. "You are a coward," Ethan said, each word deliberate and cold. "You do not deserve to speak to her." He stood and walked out of the saloon, his anger a living thing in his chest. The sun was lower now, the shadows longer, and when he reached the platform, he saw that Emma had sat down on her trunk, her hands still clasped in her lap. She looked up at his approach, and he saw that she already knew. She was smart enough to read the answer in his face. "He is not coming," she said. It was not a question. No, madam, he's not. Emma nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had suspected for the last hour. She looked down at her hands, at the worn leather of her gloves that she had mended 3 times already because she could not afford new ones. I see, she said quietly. Did he say why? Ethan could have lied, could have made up some excuse that would soften the blow, but he had the sense that this woman deserved the truth. He got scared, Ethan said, realized he was not man enough to keep the promises he made. A laugh escaped Emma, short and bitter. How appropriate. I traveled 1,500 miles to discover that my future husband is a coward. She pressed her hand to her mouth, and Ethan saw that she was shaking. Not crying, not yet, but very close to it. I have nowhere to go, she said, and the words seemed torn from her. I used all my savings for the journey. I have no family, no position, nothing to return to, even if I could afford the ticket. The fear in her voice decided something in Ethan. He had come to the mountains to be alone, to escape the complications of civilization and the demands of other people. He had built his life around solitude and self-sufficiency. But he could not walk away from this woman and leave her stranded in a strange town with no resources and no protection. His mother would rise from her grave in Missouri and box his ears if he even considered it. There is a boarding house 2 streets over, he said. Mrs. Patterson runs it. She is decent people. I will pay for a room for you while we sort this out. Emma's head snapped up. I will not accept charity from a stranger. It is not charity. That coward in the saloon said he would pay for your return ticket. Consider this part of what he owes you. Ethan held out his hand. I am Ethan Ramsey. I have a claim up in the mountains. I came down for supplies and to get my horse shod. Seems like I arrived at the right time. Emma stared at his hand, calloused and scarred from hard work, easily twice the size of her own. Everything in her Philadelphia upbringing told her not to trust him, not to accept help from a strange man in a strange place. But what choice did she have? She could not sleep on the station platform. She could not afford even one night at a boarding house on her own. And something in Ethan Ramsey's steady gaze made her believe that he meant what he said, that he was offering help without expectation of payment beyond what Harold Finch owed her. She placed her hand in his and let him help her to her feet. His grip was strong and warm, and she felt the power in him, the sense that this was a man who could protect what he chose to protect. Emma Oakley, she said, and I will pay you back, Mr. Ramsey. Every penny. I do not know how yet, but I will. Let us worry about that later, Ethan said. He lifted her trunk as if it weighed nothing, settling it on his shoulder, and gestured for her to precede him off the platform. Right now, let us get you somewhere safe. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house was a tidy 2-story building with yellow curtains in the windows and a garden out front that was surrendering to autumn. Mrs. Patterson herself was a round woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a kind heart, and she took one look at Emma's exhausted face and started clucking like a mother hen. Ethan explained the situation in broad strokes, and Mrs. Patterson's expression grew progressively more outraged. That Harold Finch ought to be horsewhipped, she declared. Leaving a young lady stranded like that. It is shameful, absolutely shameful. Come in, dear, come right in. I have a room on the 2nd floor, very clean and quiet. Mr. Ramsey, you bring that trunk right up the stairs. Ethan followed the 2 women up to a small room with a bed, a dresser, and a window that overlooked the street. It was simple but clean, and he saw Emma's shoulders relax slightly as she took it in. Mrs. Patterson bustled about, pointing out the wash basin and the extra quilts in the chest, explaining that dinner was served at 6 o'clock and breakfast at 7. When the landlady finally left to attend to her other guests, Emma turned to Ethan. They were alone in the small room, and she was suddenly very aware of how large he was, how much space he took up. But still she did not feel afraid, only grateful and overwhelmingly exhausted. Thank you, she said quietly. I do not know what I would have done if you had not stopped. You would have figured something out, Ethan said, though he was not entirely sure that was true. Medicine Bow was not a large town, and options for a woman alone were limited. You seem like the resourceful type. I used to think so, Emma said. She pulled off her bonnet and set it on the dresser, then immediately put her hands back together as if she needed something to hold on to. I managed on my own in Philadelphia for 2 years after my parents died. I thought that meant I was strong enough for anything. But this... She trailed off, shaking her head. Ethan shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the emotion in her voice. He was better with silence than with tears, better with actions than words. "Get some rest," he said. "I have business with the blacksmith, and then I will see about getting you that money from Finch. We can talk tomorrow about what comes next." He left before she could thank him again, his boots heavy on the stairs. Mrs. Patterson caught him in the front hall and pressed a key into his hand. "That's for the back door," she said, "in case you need to come and go without disturbing the other guests. And Mr. Ramsey? That girl is quality, even if she is down on her luck. You treat her right." "Yes, madam," Ethan said, and meant it. He spent the rest of the afternoon at the blacksmith's, watching while his pack horse was reshod and running through his supply list in his head. He should have been thinking about nails and flour and coffee, about whether he had enough ammunition to see him through the winter, about the repairs his cabin needed before the first snow. Instead, he kept seeing Emma Oakley's face when she realized no one was coming for her, the way she had fought to keep her composure even as her world fell apart. When the blacksmith finished, Ethan paid him and led his horses to the livery, arranging for them to be stabled overnight. Then he walked back to the Elkhorn, where he found Harold Finch still at his table, now thoroughly drunk. "You are going to give me $100, Ethan said without preamble. "That's enough for Miss Oakley's return ticket and a little extra for her trouble. And you are going to do it right now, before I lose what is left of my patience." Harold fumbled for his wallet with shaking hands. "I do not have that much on me," he slurred. "I can get it from my shop." Ethan followed him through the darkening streets to the dry goods store, a narrow building crammed with barrels and boxes and shelves of merchandise. Harold opened his cash box with trembling fingers and counted out bills and coins until he reached the sum Ethan had demanded. Ethan took the money and looked at the other man with undisguised contempt. "If I ever hear that you tried something like this again," Ethan said quietly, "I will come back down from my mountain and we will have a different kind of conversation. Do you understand me?" Harold nodded frantically, and Ethan left him there in his shop, small and pathetic among his own merchandise. Dinner at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house was served family style, with all the guests at one long table. Emma came down the stairs at 6 o'clock, having changed into a fresh dress and pinned her hair more securely. She looked less shaken than she had at the station, but there were shadows under her eyes that spoke of tears shed in private. Ethan was already at the table, and he stood when she entered, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. The other guests were a varied lot: a drummer passing through on his way to Laramie, an elderly couple visiting their daughter in town, and 2 railroad workers who boarded permanently. They were all curious about Emma, their eyes taking in her Eastern dress and Eastern manners, but Mrs. Patterson steered the conversation into safer channels, asking about weather and crops and the new railroad schedule. Emma ate mechanically, tasting nothing, but she was grateful for the food nonetheless. She had not realized how hungry she was until the plate was in front of her. Ethan ate with the focused efficiency of a man used to fueling his body rather than enjoying cuisine, but he was conscious of her beside him, the way she held her fork, the straightness of her posture. After the meal, when the other guests had dispersed to the parlor or their rooms, Ethan drew Emma aside in the hallway. He handed her the money he had collected from Harold, pressing it into her hands when she tried to refuse. "This is yours," he said firmly. "He owed you this and more. It should be enough to get you back east with something left over." Emma looked down at the bills, feeling the weight of them. This was her escape, her ticket back to Philadelphia and whatever life she could rebuild there. It was what she should want. But when she thought about the boarding house where she had worked, the endless days of changing linens and serving meals, the loneliness of her tiny room, she felt no surge of relief or anticipation. She had left that life behind for a reason, even if her gamble on a new one had failed so spectacularly. "Thank you," she said softly. "You have been extraordinarily kind to a stranger, Mr. Ramsey. I will not forget it." "What will you do?" Ethan asked. Emma shook her head slowly. "I do not know yet. I should return east, I suppose. It would be the sensible thing, but..." She trailed off, unable to articulate the reluctance she felt. Ethan understood, or thought he did. She had been brave enough to come west once, to risk everything on the hope of a better life. Going back felt like defeat, like admitting that she was not strong enough for the frontier. He knew that feeling. He had felt it himself in the months after the war when he had stood at the crossroads between returning to his family's farm in Missouri or striking out for new territory. "You do not have to decide tonight," he said. "Get some rest. Things always look clearer in the morning." Emma nodded and bid him good night, climbing the stairs to her room with slow steps. Ethan watched her go, then let himself out through Mrs. Patterson's back door and walked to the livery, where he checked on his horses and then spread his bedroll in an empty stall. He could have taken a room at the boarding house, but he was more comfortable here, with the familiar smell of hay and horses, the wide Wyoming sky visible through the open loft door. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the town settling down for the night. He should leave in the morning, he told himself. He had done what he could for Emma Oakley. She had money now and options. She was not his responsibility. But the thought of saddling up and riding back into the mountains, leaving her here to figure out her future alone, sat wrong in his chest. In her room at the boarding house, Emma also lay awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of the day. 12 hours ago, she'd been on the stagecoach, nervous but hopeful, imagining her first meeting with Harold Finch. Now that future had evaporated like morning mist, and she was left with nothing but uncertainty and the surprising kindness of a mountain man who had owed her nothing. She thought about Ethan Ramsey, about the way he had approached her on the platform with his hat in his hands, the rough gentleness of his voice. He was nothing like the men she had known in Philadelphia, nothing like her father had been, or the shop clerks and office workers who had occasionally paid court to her before her circumstances changed. He was raw and powerful, like the mountains themselves, but there was honor in him. She had seen it in the way he looked at her, had felt it in the careful distance he maintained. She fell asleep eventually, exhausted beyond the point where anxiety could keep her awake, and dreamed of endless plains and distant peaks. Morning came bright and cold, the September air carrying a hint of the winter to come. Emma woke to the sound of Mrs. Patterson moving around downstairs, preparing breakfast. She dressed carefully, brushed and pinned her hair, and forced herself to face the day. She would eat breakfast, and then she would think about what to do next. It was all she could manage. Ethan was already at the table when she came down, looking like he had been awake for hours, which, in fact, he had been. He had risen before dawn out of long habit, checked his horses, and walked the perimeter of town as the sun painted the mountains pink and gold. Medicine Bow was waking up, smoke rising from chimneys, the blacksmith already at work in his forge. It was a good town, solid and growing, full of people trying to build something lasting in hard country. He stood when Emma entered, and she managed a small smile of thanks as she took her seat. Mrs. Patterson served eggs and bacon and fresh bread, and the food was so good that Emma felt her spirits lift slightly despite everything. "I have been thinking," Ethan said when they had finished eating and the other guests had left the table. "About your situation." Emma set down her coffee cup and folded her hands in her lap, preparing herself for whatever advice he was about to offer. Probably he would suggest she take the next eastbound train, perhaps give her some practical tips for the journey. It was reasonable advice, and she would thank him for it. "Medicine Bow needs a school teacher," Ethan said instead. "The town has been trying to find one for near about 6 months now. The last teacher left to get married, and they have not been able to replace her. The pay is not much, but it comes with a small house and enough to live on." Emma stared at him, her mind racing. A school teacher. She had never considered teaching before, but she had education enough for it. Her mother had insisted she attend school through the 8th grade, and she had been an avid reader all her life. She knew her numbers and her letters, could do sums and parse grammar. More than that, she liked children. At the boarding house in Philadelphia, she had often helped the landlady's grandchildren with their lessons. "Do you think they would hire me?" she asked, and heard the hope in her own voice. "I think they would be grateful to have you," Ethan said. "The alternative is sending the children to Laramie or having them grow up ignorant, neither of which sits well with the families here. I can introduce you to the mayor this morning if you like. His name is Robert Thorne, and he's been pulling his hair out trying to solve the problem." Emma felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of fear that had been there since the previous afternoon. This could work. This could actually work. She would have a position, a home, a purpose. She would not be dependent on anyone or beholden to broken promises. The thought filled her with something close to joy. "Yes," she said firmly. "Yes, I would like that very much." The mayor's office was in the back of the general store, a cramped space filled with papers and civic anxieties. Robert Thorne was a broad man with mutton-chop whiskers and a harried expression that cleared somewhat when Ethan explained why they had come. He looked at Emma with open assessment, taking in her neat appearance and educated speech. "You have teaching experience, Miss Oakley?" he asked. Not formally," Emma admitted, deciding that honesty was the best approach. "But I have helped children with their studies, and I have a solid education myself. I can read and write well, work mathematics through geometry, and I know history and geography. I also have some skill with drawing and music, if those would be useful." Robert leaned back in his chair, which creaked alarmingly under his weight. "The truth is, Miss Oakley, we are desperate. The schoolhouse has been sitting empty since June, and the parents are furious. Most of the children have been doing chores and running wild instead of learning their letters. If you are willing to try, I am willing to give you the position. We can arrange for one of the mothers to sit in on your lessons for the first week, just to make sure everything is proper and above board. After that, the job is yours if you want it." Relief flooded through Emma so powerfully that she felt dizzy. "I want it," she said. "Thank you. Mr. Thorne, you will not regret this." They spent the next hour working out the details. The position paid $30 a month, which was not much but was more than Emma had been making at the boarding house in Philadelphia. The schoolhouse was at the east end of town, a single room with a desk and benches and a cast-iron stove for winter. The teacher's house was behind it, just one room with a sleeping loft, but it had a good roof and its own well. Emma could move in immediately if she wished. School would start the following Monday, giving her a week to prepare. When they left the mayor's office, Emma was practically vibrating with excitement and nervousness in equal measure. Ethan watched her with something like amusement, the first time she had seen anything approaching a smile on his serious face. "You did well in there," he said. "Handled yourself like you were born to it." "I hope I can live up to his expectations," Emma said. "I have never stood in front of a classroom before. What if I am terrible at it?" "Then you will learn and get better," Ethan said simply. "Same as anything else worth doing." They walked to the schoolhouse so Emma could see her new workplace. It was smaller than she had imagined, but clean and well built, with windows that let in good light and a sturdy door that would keep out the wind. The teacher's house was behind it, connected by a short covered walkway. Emma stepped inside and looked around at the bare room, the empty shelves, the ladder leading up to the sleeping loft. It was not much, but it was hers. For the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she felt like she might actually have a future. "I will need furniture," she said, her practical mind already making lists. "And supplies for the school, slates and chalk, primers and readers. How many children will there be?" "About 15, I would guess," Ethan said. "Ages 6 to 14 or so. Some of the older boys might give you trouble at first. Test to see if you can handle them. Do not let them push you around." Emma lifted her chin. "I may be from the East, Mr. Ramsey, but I am not without backbone. I can handle a few rowdy boys." Ethan believed her. There was steel in this woman, beneath the proper manners and cultured voice. She had crossed half a continent alone, had faced disappointment and betrayal without crumbling. She would make a fine teacher once she found her feet. "I need to get my supplies and head back to my claim," he said, though the words felt heavier than they should. "But I will be back in a month or so for winter provisions. If you need anything before then, you can leave word at the general store. Thompson's oldest boy makes a supply run up to the mining camps twice a month. He passes near my place." Emma felt a flutter of something that might have been panic at the thought of him leaving, which was absurd. She barely knew this man. He had helped her when she needed it, but she could not expect him to stay in town just to make her feel secure. She was on her own now, which was exactly what she had wanted. "Thank you, Mr. Ramsey," she said, holding out her hand formally, "for everything you have done. I truly cannot express my gratitude." Ethan took her hand and felt again the delicacy of it against his own rough palm. "You would have done the same," he said, though he was not sure that was true. Most people looked out for themselves first, but he wanted to believe she would have helped if their positions had been reversed. He left her there at the schoolhouse, standing in the doorway with the Wyoming sky huge above her, and went to collect his supplies. He spent the rest of the day packing his horses, loading up flour and coffee and salt, ammunition and nails and a new saw blade. He should have left immediately, ridden out while there was still good daylight. Instead, he found himself walking back to Mrs. Patterson's boarding house as evening fell, telling himself he just wanted to make sure Emma was settling in all right. She was in the parlor with Mrs. Patterson and two other women from town who had heard about the new teacher and come to introduce themselves. They were friendly and curious, asking about Philadelphia and her journey west, offering to help her get settled in her new home. Emma was handling it well, answering questions with grace while carefully avoiding the subject of Harold Finch and why she had come to Medicine Bow in the first place. Mrs. Patterson, bless her, had clearly spread a version of the story that painted Emma as a teacher who had come west seeking opportunity, not a mail-order bride who had been abandoned. Ethan stood in the doorway, unnoticed, and watched Emma laugh at something one of the women said. She looked different already, less strained, more hopeful. She would be fine here, he told himself. She did not need him looking after her. He should go. But when Emma glanced up and saw him, her face brightened in a way that made his chest feel tight. She excused herself from the women and came to him, her skirts rustling. "Mr. Ramsey, I thought you had left already," she said. "Leaving at first light tomorrow," he said. "I just wanted to check that you were doing all right." "I am doing very well," Emma said, and it was almost true. "Mrs. Patterson has been wonderful, and the ladies from town have been so welcoming. Mrs. Henderson has offered to lend me some furniture for the schoolhouse, and Mrs. Blake says her husband can deliver firewood for the winter. Everyone has been so kind." "Good," Ethan said. "That is good." They stood there in the hallway, neither quite sure what to say next. There should not have been anything to say. They were strangers who had crossed paths briefly, nothing more. But Emma felt the pull of something unfinished, the sense that this man mattered in a way she did not fully understand yet. "Will you really come back in a month?" she asked, trying to make it sound casual. "I will," Ethan said. "I always do a supply run before the heavy snows." "Then I will see you then," Emma said. She hesitated, then added, "I hope your claim is productive, Mr. Ramsey. I hope the mountains treat you well." "I hope the children do the same for you," Ethan said. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture somewhere between formal and affectionate, and left before he could think of reasons to stay longer. He rode out before dawn the next morning, his pack horses loaded and his path clear. The trail into the Medicine Bow Range was familiar to him, steep and rocky in places, but offering views that never failed to stir something in him. He loved these mountains, loved the silence and the clean air, the way a man could go days without seeing another soul. He had built a good life here, solitary but satisfying. So why did he keep thinking about green eyes and honey-colored hair, about a woman who had thanked him with a handshake while something unspoken passed between them? Emma spent her first week in Medicine Bow in a whirlwind of preparation. She moved her few belongings into the little house behind the schoolhouse, arranged the borrowed furniture, and spent hours going through the supplies that had been left by the previous teacher. She made lists of what she would need, planned out her first lessons, and tried to calm the butterflies in her stomach whenever she thought about standing in front of 15 children and actually teaching them something. The mothers of her future students came by one, introducing themselves and their children, assessing the new teacher with varying degrees of skepticism. Emma understood. She was young and untried, an Easterner who might not last through her first winter. She would have to prove herself, and she was determined to do exactly that. Her first day of school was a Monday in mid-September, the morning crisp with autumn. Emma dressed carefully in her most professional dress, pinned her hair severely, and stood at the schoolhouse door as her students arrived. They came in ones and twos, some eager and curious, others reluctant and sullen. She learned their names, assigned them seats, and launched into her first lesson with more confidence than she felt. It was harder than she had expected. The children ranged in age from 6-year-old Lucy Henderson, who could barely write her own name, to 14-year-old Jack Morrison, who towered over Emma and made it clear he thought school was a waste of time. The younger children were wiggly and easily distracted. The older ones had been out of school for months and had lost whatever discipline they once had. By the end of the first day, Emma's voice was hoarse and her head was pounding, but she had survived. She had actually survived. The days turned into weeks. Emma found her rhythm, learned which students needed encouragement and which needed firm boundaries. She discovered that she had a talent for explaining things in ways that made sense to young minds, for making lessons interesting enough to hold attention. The children began to respect her, even Jack Morrison, who grudgingly admitted to his mother that the new teacher was not half bad. September gave way to October, and the aspens on the mountainsides turned gold. Emma had been in Medicine Bow for 6 weeks, and it was starting to feel like home. She had friends now, women like Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Blake, who had welcomed her into their circle. She had purpose and independence, her own little house and her own money earned through her own work. It was everything she had hoped for when she left Philadelphia. But in the quiet moments, usually in the evening when her lessons were planned and her house was tidy, she found herself thinking about Ethan Ramsey. She wondered if he was well, if the mountains were treating him kindly. She wondered if he thought about her at all, or if she had been just another stranger he had helped and forgotten. She was grading slates one evening in late October when there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Ethan standing on her doorstep, his hat in his hands and his horses tied to the post outside the schoolhouse. Her heart leaped in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with the sudden, undeniable joy of seeing him again. "Mr. Ramsey," she said, and could not keep the smile from her face. "You came back." "I said I would," Ethan replied. He looked at her standing in the doorway, lit from behind by lamplight, and felt something settle in him that he had not realized was restless. "I heard in town that you have been doing well with the school, that the children like you." "They are good children," Emma said, "most of the time anyway. Would you like to come in? I have coffee on the stove." Ethan should have said no. It was not proper for a man to visit an unmarried woman alone in her home, even in the relatively casual society of a frontier town. But he found himself nodding and following her inside, ducking his head to clear the doorway. The little house was warm and welcoming, made homey by small touches that spoke of Emma's personality. Books on the shelf, a vase with dried flowers, a quilt in cheerful colors folded over the back of the single chair. She poured him coffee and gestured for him to sit while she perched on the edge of her trunk, which doubled as storage and seating. They talked for hours. She told him about her students, about the challenges and small triumphs of teaching. He told her about his claim, about the gold he was pulling from the mountain, and his plans to expand his operation come spring. They talked about books they had read, about the war and its aftermath, about what had brought them both west. The conversation flowed easily, comfortably, as if they had known each other for years instead of weeks. It was past midnight when Ethan finally stood to leave, suddenly aware of how long he had been there. "I should go," he said reluctantly. "I have business tomorrow before I head back up." Emma walked him to the door, sorry to see the evening end. "Will you be in town long?" "A few days," Ethan said. "I have a meeting with a supply company about getting equipment up to my claim. After that, I will be heading back before the weather turns." "Then perhaps I will see you again before you leave," Emma said, trying to keep her tone casual. "I would like that," Ethan said, and meant it more than was probably wise. He came back the next evening and the evening after that. On the third night, he brought her a gift, a carved wooden box that he had made during the long winter evenings in his cabin. It was simple but beautifully crafted, with a tight-fitting lid and smooth corners. Emma turned it over in her hands, marveling at the workmanship. "This is exquisite," she said softly. "Did you really make this?" "A man needs something to do when the snow is too deep to work," Ethan said, embarrassed by her praise. "I thought you might use it for school supplies or something." Emma looked up at him, and something in her expression made his breath catch. "Thank you," she said. "I will treasure it." The air between them felt different suddenly, charged with something neither of them was quite ready to name. Ethan cleared his throat and stepped back, putting distance between them before he did something foolish. "I have to leave tomorrow," he said. "Winter comes early in the high country. If I do not get back soon, I might get snowed in on the wrong side of the pass." Emma felt disappointment settle heavy in her chest. She had known this was coming, but knowing did not make it easier. "I understand," she said. "Will you come back in the spring?" "Before that," Ethan said, "I will be down for Christmas supplies in December, weather permitting. And I would like to write to you if that would be all right. I know it is not the same as talking, but—" "I would love that," Emma said quickly, too quickly, revealing more than she intended. "I would very much enjoy corresponding with you, Mr. Ramsey." "Then maybe you should call me Ethan," he said. "Mr. Ramsey makes me feel like I should be wearing a collar and tie." Emma laughed. "Only if you call me Emma." "Emma," he said, testing her name on his tongue, and she felt a shiver run through her at the way he said it, rough and warm. He left the next morning with a promise to write and a backward glance that lingered longer than necessary. Emma watched him ride out of town, his broad back straight in the saddle, and felt like something precious was being carried away with him. The letters started arriving 2 weeks later, brought down by Thompson's boy on his supply run. Ethan's handwriting was rough but legible, his spelling sometimes creative, but his words were thoughtful and revealing. He wrote about his work on the claim, about the fox that had been stealing from his supplies and the elk he had seen at dawn. He asked about her students, about the town, about whether she was staying warm enough as winter approached. Emma wrote back with equal eagerness, her letters filled with stories about teaching and observations about frontier life. She told him about the first snowfall, about the children's excitement when she let them have a snowball fight during recess. She asked him about his past, about his family in Missouri, and what had brought him west. Through their letters, they learned each other. Emma discovered that Ethan had been a scout during the war, that he had seen things that still haunted him in quiet moments. He had come west to find peace, to build something with his own hands in a place where the past could not reach him. Ethan learned that Emma's parents had died of typhoid within days of each other, that she had been utterly alone in the world when she answered Harold Finch's advertisement. She had come west not just for security, but for a chance to reinvent herself, to be more than a servant in a boarding house. November passed in a blur of letters and lessons and preparations for winter. Emma's students were progressing well, and the town had fully accepted her as one of their own. She was happy, genuinely happy, in a way she had not been in years, but there was a hollowness at the center of it all, an awareness that something was missing. December came with heavy snows and bitter cold. Emma kept her schoolhouse warm with the wood Mrs. Blake's husband had delivered, taught her students to appreciate literature and mathematics, and counted the days until Ethan said he would come down from the mountains. He arrived on the 20th of December, riding through a fresh snowfall with his pack horses and a smile that made her forget the cold. Emma saw him from the schoolhouse window during lessons and had to force herself to focus on her students rather than watching him lead his horses to the livery. When school let out, she hurried through her usual afternoon routine and was just changing into a fresh dress when he knocked on her door. "Ethan," she said, and her face lit up in a way that made his heart hammer in his chest. "Emma," he replied, and they stood there grinning at each other like fools until she remembered herself and invited him in. They talked over coffee, catching up on everything that could not be conveyed in letters. He had brought his gold down to sell, had done better this season than he expected. She had finished the school term strong, with all her students showing marked improvement. They were comfortable with each other in a way that felt both familiar and thrilling, like coming home to somewhere you had never been. On his third evening in town, Ethan asked Emma to walk with him. They bundled up against the cold and strolled through Medicine Bow, their breath making clouds in the frigid air. The town was decorated for Christmas, pine boughs and red ribbons on doors, candles glowing in windows. It was beautiful in a simple, heartfelt way that made Emma feel a surge of affection for this place that had become home. They walked to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open land and the mountains rose dark against the starlit sky. Ethan stopped and turned to face her, and Emma saw something serious in his expression, something that made her pulse quicken. "Emma, I need to tell you something," he said. "I've been thinking about this for weeks now, wondering if I was a fool for even considering it. But life is too short and too uncertain to spend it wondering." Emma's breath caught. "What is it?" Ethan took her hands in his, big and warm, even through their gloves. "I care about you," he said simply, "more than I have cared about anyone in a very long time. I think about you when I'm working my claim, wonder what you are doing, whether you are happy. When I come down to town, it is not just for supplies anymore. It is because I need to see you." Emma felt tears prick her eyes, born of relief and joy, and something deeper that she had been afraid to name. "I care about you too," she whispered, "so much that it frightens me sometimes." "I do not have much to offer," Ethan continued, the words coming faster now that he had started. "I live in a cabin on a mountain, miles from the nearest neighbor. My life is hard and sometimes lonely. I cannot give you the comforts you might have had back east, but I can promise you this. I will work every day to make you happy. I will protect you and provide for you and respect you. And I will love you with everything I have." Emma was crying now, tears freezing on her cheeks in the cold air. "Is this a proposal, Ethan Ramsey?" "It is," he said. "I know we have not known each other long, and I know you have already been disappointed by one Western man, but I'm asking you to trust me, to take a chance on a mountain man who fell in love with a school teacher. Will you marry me, Emma?" "Yes," Emma said, laughing and crying at once. "Yes, absolutely, yes." Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest, and Emma felt like she had finally found what she had been looking for when she left Philadelphia. Not security or comfort, but this: love and passion and the promise of a future built on trust and respect. They were married on Christmas Eve in the small church at the center of town, with Mrs. Patterson and the mayor and half of Medicine Bow in attendance. Emma wore her best dress with a sprig of pine in her hair, and Ethan wore a new shirt that Mrs. Henderson had helped him pick out. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan kissed her with a tenderness that made the women in the congregation sigh. The town threw them a reception at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house with food and music and genuine warmth. Emma had never felt so welcomed, so completely part of a community. These people had accepted her when she had nowhere else to go, and now they were celebrating her happiness with sincere joy. As the party wound down and the guests began to drift away, Emma and Ethan slipped out into the cold December night. They walked hand in hand to the little house behind the schoolhouse where Emma had been living for the past 3 months. Tomorrow they would discuss the future, figure out what their life together would look like. Tonight, they just wanted to be alone. Inside, Ethan built up the fire while Emma lit candles, both of them suddenly shy now that they were actually married. But when Ethan turned from the stove and saw Emma standing in the candlelight, her hair down around her shoulders and her eyes soft with love, all his nervousness evaporated. He crossed to her in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the pent-up longing of the past months. Emma melted into him, into his strength and warmth, and felt something unlock deep inside her. This was right. This was what she had been meant for. Not the careful plans and practical arrangements she had made with Harold Finch, but this wild, unexpected love that had found her when she was stranded and alone. They made love slowly, tenderly, learning each other's bodies with gentle exploration. Ethan was careful with her, conscious of his strength and her inexperience, but Emma surprised him with her passion, her eagerness to be close to him. When they finally lay tangled together in her narrow bed, exhausted and content, Emma felt like her life had finally begun. The next morning, they woke to find a fresh foot of snow had fallen overnight. They lay in bed and talked about the future, about what their marriage would look like. Emma loved teaching, and she was good at it. The town needed her, and she needed the purpose and community her work provided. But Ethan's claim was his livelihood, and he could not simply abandon it. They worked out a compromise. Ethan would continue working his claim during the warmer months from April through October. Emma would finish out the school year, then come to November and stay through the holidays before returning for the new school term. During the summer, when school was not in session, Emma would come up to the cabin and they would live together in the mountains. It was not a perfect solution, but it was workable, and it meant neither of them had to give up the work that mattered to them. January brought bitter cold and deep snows. Ethan stayed in town with Emma, helping to repair the schoolhouse roof and doing odd jobs for the people who had been kind to his wife. He sat in on some of her lessons and was impressed by how she commanded the classroom, how she made even the most reluctant students engage with their learning. She was a natural teacher, and he was proud of her in a way that had nothing to do with his own accomplishments. In February, they moved some of Emma's things up to Ethan's cabin, making several trips with the pack horses through snow that was sometimes chest deep. The cabin was larger than Emma had expected, built solid with thick logs and a good stone fireplace. It was isolated, perched on a ridge with a view of the valley below, but it was also beautiful in a stark, elemental way. Emma could see why Ethan loved it here. She spent a week with him at the cabin, learning how to live in the mountains. He taught her to snowshoe, to read the weather, to recognize the signs of avalanche danger. She learned that he kept his supplies meticulously organized, that he was an excellent cook with game and beans, that he played the harmonica on quiet evenings. She fell even more in love with him in that week, seeing him in his element, watching how capable and at ease he was in this harsh environment. When she returned to town for the spring term, she carried with her a sense of completeness, of having two homes now instead of just one. She had her work and her friends in Medicine Bow, and she had Ethan and the mountains waiting for her when she needed wildness and solitude. Spring came slowly to Wyoming, the snow retreating grudgingly from the valleys and lingering in the high country well into May. Emma finished the school year with a sense of accomplishment, her students all passing their examinations, and several of the older ones ready to move on to more advanced studies. The town council offered her the position again for the following year, with a raise in pay, and she accepted gladly. In June, she closed up the little house behind the schoolhouse and rode up to the cabin with Ethan. She would spend the next 3 months with him, and she was eager for the time together, for the chance to be just husband and wife without the demands of work and community pulling at them. The summer was everything she could have hoped for. Ethan worked his claim during the day, and Emma kept the cabin and tended the small garden she planted. She read books in the afternoon sunshine, went fishing in the clear mountain streams, and walked the high meadows where wildflowers bloomed in profusion. At night, they made love in the big bed Ethan had built and talked about their dreams for the future. It was in August that Emma realized she was pregnant. She had missed her monthly courses and been queasy in the mornings for 2 weeks before she finally acknowledged what was happening. The realization filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. A baby. She was going to have a baby. She told Ethan that evening, watching his face carefully for his reaction. He went very still, his eyes going wide, and then a smile broke across his face like sunrise. A baby, he said wonderingly. We are going to have a baby. Are you happy? Emma asked, suddenly needing to hear him say it. Happy does not begin to cover it, Ethan said. He pulled her into his arms, cradling her against his chest. You have given me everything, Emma, everything I did not even know I wanted. They spent the rest of the summer preparing for the baby, talking through the logistics of Emma's pregnancy and the changes it would bring. She would stay in town for the birth, which was due in early March. Mrs. Patterson had already promised to help, and there was a doctor in Medicine Bow now, a young man who had arrived in the spring to set up practice. Ethan would come down from the mountains as soon as the passes were clear and stay with her for the birth and the first months of their child's life. Emma returned to teaching in September, and her pregnancy progressed smoothly despite the demands of her work. The town was excited about the baby, with the women offering advice and hand-me-down clothing and home remedies for morning sickness. Emma had never felt so cared for, so completely part of a community. Ethan came down from the mountains in early November, as soon as the first heavy snows suggested the passes might close. He would not risk being separated from Emma when the baby came. He found work in town to keep himself busy and earn extra money, working for the blacksmith and helping with repairs around town. In the evenings, he and Emma would sit by the fire in their little house, his hand on her swelling belly, feeling their child move and kick. Their son was born on a bitterly cold March morning in 1880, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the whole town. Ethan was there for the birth, holding Emma's hand through the pain and the fear, and when the doctor placed the baby in his arms, he felt his world shift on its axis. This tiny, perfect creature was his son, his and Emma's. The miracle of it overwhelmed him. They named him Samuel after Ethan's father, and he had Emma's green eyes and Ethan's dark hair. He was healthy and strong, and Emma took to motherhood with the same determination she brought to teaching. The first months were exhausting, full of sleepless nights and constant demands, but they were also filled with a joy so profound it sometimes brought tears to Emma's eyes. In June, when Samuel was 3 months old and Emma had recovered her strength, they made the journey up to the cabin as a family. Emma had arranged for the school board to hire a substitute teacher for the following year, explaining that she needed time to be with her son while he was small. The board had been understanding, promising that her position would be waiting for her whenever she was ready to return. The summer of 1880 was one of the happiest of Emma's life. She cared for Samuel while Ethan worked his claim, and the baby thrived in the mountain air. He was an easy child, quick to smile, and he seemed to love the wildness and space of the high country. In the evenings, Ethan would come home dusty and tired, and Emma would hand him his son, watching as her husband's face softened with pure love. They talked about the future during those long summer evenings. Ethan's claim was producing well, better than he had hoped when he first staked it. With the money he was making, they could build a better life, maybe even a larger house closer to town, so Emma could continue teaching while still being near him. Or they could stay in the mountains, raise their family in the wild places, teach their children to love the land the way they did. In the end, they chose a middle path. Ethan sold his claim in the fall of 1881 for a substantial sum, enough to buy a piece of land on the outskirts of Medicine Bow and build a proper house. It had 4 rooms, a real kitchen, and a porch that faced the mountains. Emma could walk to the schoolhouse in 15 minutes, and Ethan was close enough to town to work as a guide and outfitter for hunters and prospectors who wanted to venture into the high country. Emma returned to teaching when Samuel was 2, and the town welcomed her back with open arms. She was a better teacher now, more patient and understanding, shaped by her experiences as a wife and mother. Samuel would sometimes sit in the back of the classroom during lessons, playing quietly while his mother taught and the students adored him. Their daughter was born in 1883, a tiny girl with Ethan's dark eyes and a disposition as sunny as her brother's. They named her Clara, and she completed their family in a way that felt perfect and right. Ethan was a devoted father, playing with his children and teaching them about the natural world, while Emma made sure they had education and structure and love in abundance. The years passed in a blur of small moments and large joys. Samuel grew tall and strong like his father, with a curiosity about the mountains that led Ethan to start taking him on expeditions as soon as he was old enough. Clara was her mother's daughter, quick-minded and book-loving, already reading by the time she was 4 years old. They were happy children, secure in their parents' love and their place in the world. Emma continued teaching until 1890, when she finally retired to focus on her growing family. She and Ethan had added a 3rd child by then, another son named Jacob, who had come as a surprise when Emma thought her childbearing years were done. She was 43 years old, her hair now streaked with silver, but she felt younger than she had at 20 when she had stood on that station platform wondering if anyone would come. Ethan was 48, his body still strong from years of hard work, but now carrying the marks of a life well lived. His hair was long and gray, his face weathered by sun and wind, and Emma loved him more than she had thought possible to love another person. He was her rock, her partner, the man who had saved her, and then built a life with her that was richer than any dream. They sat together on their porch one evening in the summer of 1893, watching Samuel and Clara help their younger brother build a fort in the yard. The mountains stood eternal in the distance, the same peaks Ethan had worked all those years ago, the same views that had brought him peace when he needed it most. "Do you ever regret it?" Emma asked softly. "Giving up your claim, settling down in town? You loved that solitude." Ethan reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Not for a single moment," he said. "I thought I needed solitude, but what I really needed was you. You and this." He gestured at their children, at the house they had built together, at the life they had created. "I was alone on that mountain, Emma. I did not realize how alone until I saw you standing at that station, and something in me recognized what I had been missing." Emma leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him, the steady beat of his heart. "I was so scared that day," she admitted. "I thought my life was over before it had really begun. And then you came, this mountain man with gentle eyes, and you saved me." "We saved each other," Ethan corrected. "You gave me a reason to come down from the mountain. You gave me a family, a purpose beyond just surviving. You gave me everything." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Their children's laughter drifted up to the porch, sweet and unself-conscious. Samuel was 15 now, already showing signs of the man he would become. Clara was 10, bright and curious and full of plans for her future. Jacob was 3, still young enough to believe the world was entirely safe and good. Emma thought about the path that had brought her here, from Philadelphia to Medicine Bow, from terrified and abandoned to loved and secure. It had not been the life she planned when she answered Harold Finch's advertisement. It had been so much better than she could have imagined. She had found not just security, but passion, not just a place to belong, but a place to thrive. She had found love in its truest, deepest form, and she had built a family and a legacy that would outlast her. "Tell me again," she said to Ethan, as she sometimes did when she needed to hear it. "Tell me about the day you first saw me." Ethan smiled, knowing this story by heart now, having told it dozens of times to Emma and their children. "I saw this woman standing alone at the station," he began, his voice soft and warm. "She was trying so hard to be brave, but I could see the fear in her eyes. No one had come for her, and she was all alone in a strange place. And I knew, right in that moment, that I could not leave her there. So I came, and she changed my life." "You changed mine," Emma whispered. "We changed each other's," Ethan said. He kissed her forehead, then her lips, tasting the salt of happy tears. "And I would do it all over again, every single moment, just to end up right here." The years continued to roll by with the gentle inevitability of seasons changing. Samuel grew into a man very much like his father, tall and strong with a deep love for the mountains. He worked as a guide alongside Ethan, taking parties up into the high country and teaching them the skills his father had taught him. Clara attended the university in Laramie, one of the first women from Medicine Bow to pursue higher education, and returned to teach at the school where her mother had once stood in front of uncertain students and found her calling. Jacob, the surprise baby, turned out to have his father's hands, carving and building with a natural skill that led him to apprentice with a furniture maker in town. Emma and Ethan watched their children grow and thrive with the satisfaction of knowing they had given them roots and wings in equal measure. They had taught them to work hard, to value education, to treat others with respect and kindness. But more than anything, they had taught them by example what it meant to love completely, to choose your partner every day and build a life together through compromise and respect. In 1898, Samuel married a young woman named Grace, a rancher's daughter with a practical mind and a kind heart. Ethan and Emma gained their first grandchild the following year, a grandson named Ethan Samuel, who arrived screaming into the world with his grandfather's dark eyes and his grandmother's stubborn chin. Emma held him in her arms and felt the circle complete, seeing in this tiny face the continuation of everything she and Ethan had built. Clara married in 1901, choosing a journalist from Laramie who shared her love of books and ideas. They settled in town, close enough for Clara to continue teaching and to visit her parents regularly. Jacob remained in Medicine Bow, eventually taking over the furniture business when his mentor retired and marrying a quiet girl who worked at the general store. Emma and Ethan's house became the gathering place for their growing family, especially on holidays and special occasions. The table would be crowded with children and grandchildren, the noise and laughter filling the rooms with life. Emma would look around at these moments, at the faces she loved, at the life they had created from that chance meeting on a train station platform, and feel overwhelming gratitude. They grew old together, as partners do when they are lucky. Ethan's hair went completely white, his body slower but still strong. Emma developed lines around her eyes from years of laughter, her hair silvering, but her eyes still as green as they had been the day he first saw her. They walked together every evening when the weather allowed, holding hands like young sweethearts and talking about everything and nothing. In the summer of 1912, on a warm July evening, they sat on their porch watching the sunset as they had done thousands of times before. Samuel and his family were visiting, along with Clara and her husband, and the grandchildren were playing in the yard, their voices high and happy. Ethan was 70 years old now, Emma 65, and they had been married for 37 years. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night in my little house?" Emma asked, her hand warm in his, "when you came to check that I was settling in?" "I remember every word I have ever said to you," Ethan replied. "But which particular night are you thinking of?" "The night you gave me the carved box," Emma said. "You told me you would be back, and I asked if you would really come back, like I did not quite believe it." "And I told you I would," Ethan said. "And I did. You always did," Emma said softly. "You always came back. In all these years, through everything, you always came back to me." "There was never anywhere else I wanted to be," Ethan said simply. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it, a gesture he had made so many times it was as natural as breathing. "You were my home, Emma. You still are." They sat together as the sun sank behind the mountains, surrounded by the family they had created, the life they had built. The mountain man who had seen a woman standing alone at a station, and the woman who had been brave enough to accept help from a stranger, had found in each other everything they needed. The wind carried the scent of pine and wildflowers, the distant sound of the river, the closer sound of children laughing. Medicine Bow spread out below them, grown larger over the years, but still recognizably the town that had given Emma a second chance and Ethan a reason to come down from his mountain. "I love you," Emma said, as she had said countless times before, and would say countless times again. "I love you," Ethan replied, the words as true and solid as the mountains themselves. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they sat together in perfect contentment, two people who had found each other when they needed it most and built a love that would echo through generations. The mountain man had come when no one else would, and in doing so, had changed both their lives forever.